Hello and welcome to today's Cento webinar entitled The Critical Role of Clinical Information in Producing a Meaningful Genetic Diagnostic Report. My name is Ilona Gallagher-Kuritsky, and I'm a member of Centogene's Human Phenotype Ontology, or HPO team. My team is the one responsible for receiving your clinical information through submitted documentations and extracting essential clinical information for genetic analyses. Today, I have the pleasure of discussing three topics with you: Human Phenotype Ontology terms, HPO terms, and their importance in documenting patients' symptoms, the importance of structured clinical information in increasing diagnostic field of genetic testing, and thirdly, using CentoPortal in order to conveniently enter clinical information for each patient. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A chat, and we'll refer back to them at the end of the presentation. This promises to be a very informative webinar, so let's begin. Making the correct diagnosis is arguably the most important role of the physician. For genetic diagnoses, particularly in complex cases, the clinician's role is much more than just one of identifying the need for genetic testing and sending a sample to Centogene. Clinicians are primary care partners who interface with patients, listen to their complaints, and understand their presentations. Therefore, clinicians are those who are sending detailed information about presentation to geneticists and bioinformaticians and are essential in helping the diagnostic process. That said, clinical phenotype is not always so straightforward or standard. There's a need for clinicians to share information in a way that geneticists and bioinformaticians can understand and use, and reduce communication barriers. This information transfer is rather challenging, considering that clinicians carry a highly specialized medical knowledge of terminology, and also that there's a wide array of synonyms that can be used to describe any given term. For instance, one clinician may describe the muscle weakness observed in patient X as decreased muscle tone. Another may say hypotonia, another floppy baby or low tone. Similarly, a reduced head circumference may be described as microcephaly, but it would be also reasonable to state that a patient has a small head, reduced skull size, or similar. Moreover, a clinician might actually just give a number in order to indicate that this individual is in a lower than expected circumference percentile. As a result of this variety, there's a risk of communication gaps and a need to standardize medical information into a common language that bioinformaticians and geneticists can readily use. This need for a standardized language and the use thereafter is in order to prevent communication breakdowns and to ensure the highest quality results possible are extracted within our lab. What's essential in order to doing this is an ontology. An ontology, in this sense, is a controlled vocabulary of logically defined interrelated terms used to annotate data. In general, an ontology is a set of philosophical questioning that looks at text or any existing entries and questions how they're related to one another, whether they fall into specific hierarchies, and where similarities exist or do not exist. The benefit of creating such an ontology for medical terms relevant to rare and common diseases is that it allows for deep phenotyping. When we say deep phenotyping, what we're referring to is a precise and comprehensive analysis of phenotypic abnormalities in which the individual components of the phenotype are observed and described. That is to say, by standardizing terminology, we become better able to annotate clinical profiles of given patients. Become better able to annotate known diseases, specific genes, and specific variants. Along this line of thinking, the Human Phenotype Ontology was created for such medical ontology capabilities. In this case, it's looking at medically relevant terms and their relationships to one another. Within the HPO project, Human Phenotype Ontology, the first thing that was done was a creation of phenotype vocabulary. This was done originally in English and is now in the process of being translated into at least 6 other languages. Secondly, through the HPO project, there's a creation of disease phenotype annotations. That is, a link between specific HPO terms and diseases. Thirdly, using the previous 2 points, algorithms were created to operate on these 2 points and allow gene identification based on clinical annotation for a given patient. As we can obviously see then, HPO terms are an essential link between phenotypes and disease. HPO terms ontology in and of itself is represented as a directed acyclical graph, as you see on the right-hand side of this slide. What this means is that there are parent terms higher up, which reflect relationships to their child terms below. Any term may have multiple parents reflecting multiple semantic relationships. So as we see here then, organ abnormality is the parent to cardiovascular abnormality, and a lower subclass then is cardiac abnormality. If we jump a little bit lower down, we would also say that the abnormality of atrial septum could be described as being a child of both abnormality of the septa and of the atria. This is an important relationship as it creates the hierarchy and doesn't allow a cyclical structure. That means it becomes very defined which is top and which is bottom. And we'll go forward and see why that becomes very important. For any of these terms, there's something called a true path rule which applies. That is to say, for an annotated term, such as abnormality of the cardiac atria, all parent terms annotated above are also annotated to that term. What does that mean? That means if I've only given you the term organ abnormality, we don't know anything of what exists below. However, if a clinician provides us with the term abnormality of cardiac septa, it becomes very clear that inclusive to that term is also all of the heritage behind it, that is cardiac malformation, cardiac abnormality, cardiovascular abnormality, and organ abnormality. From this, we can imagine that the more specific a term is, the more likely it is that the term is annotated to less diseases. The more general a term is, the more likely it will map to more diseases. The more specific the term is, the better it can help us narrow down the disease or the gene. And in doing so, we say that it has higher information content. We'll look at this concept briefly on the next slide, and then go into the mathematical approaches to define information content. As alluded to, a given HPO term does not describe an individual's disease, rather the phenotypical abnormality associated with the disease. This means that the same HPO term could be mapped to multiple diseases. In fact, we'd expect that. And any given disease would be mapped to multiple HPO terms. This figure from Robinson and colleagues nicely diagrams this concept. We see that at the time of the study, there were 1,138 conditions associated with abnormality of the muscular system. As we move down this hierarchy, however, there's fewer and fewer diseases associated with any given term, such that as we move to abnormality of the hip, following the left side of the diagram, it's only 166, and further down to multiple hip dislocations, it's moving into 78, 32, and further. Mathematically, we can use a similar approach in order to identify this as information content. And the mathematics are rather simple. Information content is equal to the negative log of the frequency of a term. The frequency of a term is defined as the number of diseases annotated by a given term divided by the total population of possible diseases. Let's look at the slide for a better example, where we consider possible options of 4,813 diseases and two terms, abnormality of the musculoskeletal system and atrioventricular block. We see that the term to the left is much more broad and would expect to see it in many, many more diseases. That is indeed the case. In this case, the frequency, so the number of diseases it presents in, is 2,352 diseases of the 4,813. Our information content then becomes the negative log of that division factor, which is 0.72, a rather low number. In contrast, when we look at atrioventricular block, this term is much, much more specific. And we see that it's annotated in only 3 of the 4,813 diseases. That frequency is much lower, so the negative log of that number becomes a much higher number, much more specific, and we state in this case that it has a higher information content. For those interested in viewing this in a bit more of a tangible fashion, the hierarchical nature of HPO terms are readily viewable online, and further highlight that a specific term is attached to a higher information content. That is, the more specific the term, the lower number of associated diseases, and the lower the number of associated genes. If you're interested, there's a website listed on the lower right-hand side of the page. Please copy that down. You can play around with multiple terms to see this for yourself. To highlight it one step further, let's look at the example of seizures, a very common term that we see in HPO department. As we see here, the term seizures is associated with roughly 2,000 diseases. In contrast, let's look at the bottom of this table. Nocturnal seizures is only associated with 4 diseases. Quite a stark contrast. When we then look at the gene associations, it's quite similar. Seizures, a higher class term, as you see on the left-hand side of the page, is associated with 1,200 genes, roughly 1,300, but only 3 genes are associated with the term nocturnal seizures. What does this highlight? Again, it highlights the idea the more specific a term is, the higher the information content. It also gives an opportunity to highlight one important point. The more specific the information received at Centogene is, the more specific our results can be. That is to say, if a patient only has one specific type of seizures, it's very important to name only the one type of seizures at hand in order to give us a very directed search. Where the term seizures is listed in addition to specific types of seizures, it's an open-ended question that doesn't allow interpretation, and it could be that one is presented with multiple types. And at that point, we've moved from singular gene candidates or tens of gene candidates into the thousands. Of course, there is variability in the presentation of diseases between patients. So specific terms provided by the clinician may not be the specific term annotated to a disease. This isn't something to cause concern, however. It's still better to be as specific as possible when giving clinical information. Where terms are given that do not directly match those annotated to the disease, a phenotypic similarity between 2 queries can be made, and we can look for good matches. This is considered similarity scoring. Similarity scoring works in the following way. We're going to look for the average maximum information content of the most informative common ancestors of terms. Here we see a few examples on this slide. And not to overcomplicate things, up on the left-hand side, A, we see 2 terms on the lower side, downward slanting palpebral fissures and hypertelorism. Those were the 2 terms provided by the clinician in this case. And in the case of Noonan syndrome here, highlighted by the yellow, they also happen to match the query that we'd expect from Noonan syndrome to a T. In contrast, those same 2 words partially fit with opaque syndrome. That is to say, hypertelorism is within expectations, that's highlighted by the yellow, and one common ancestor also happens to be there, abnormality of the eyelid. In this case, we're going to run similar mathematics in order to compare the 2 terms. However, we're going to use the most common ancestor possible. So for both of these terms are annotated. We see that one ends up with a similarity score of 3.42 and the other of 2.75. That is to say, when we average out the similarity scores, so the best scores that we saw from the previous thing, that the higher the score is more likely. Noonan syndrome, as we have a higher match, is of course our better option in this case. What's important to take home from this slide is actually 2 points though. It's good to be specific as it increases information context, and where a term doesn't match the annotated conditions, the common ancestor will still be used. Secondly is actually a completely different concept, and that is it's negative to be too general. If the same clinician in this case had only written abnormality of the eye and not given the 2 terms that are presented on the screen, it would have hindered the analysis, and identification of the best possible candidate disease or gene would have been much more difficult. Wonderful. So with that, we've completed our first task, defining human phenotype ontology terms and their importance in patients' documentation of symptoms. Next, we will discuss the importance of structured clinical information in increasing diagnostic yield with genetic testing. As we've learned from the HPO terms in the past section, it's important to have a set of standardized language in order to bridge the clinical picture and the genetic data to identify candidates. We've established that it's important to be as specific as possible and to go up the hierarchy where necessary, but not the reverse, not too high. When we look at this study here, it gives a good example as to another factor that's of importance to consider, and that is the number of terms that can be relevant for a case. Specific information is good, but as this example will show, a full clinical description using multiple specific HPO terms is even better. Triano and colleagues completed whole exome sequencing for 2,819 samples from 1,000 families. For these analyses, clinical information was given by clinicians, and these were then translated into HPO terms. Interestingly, the authors found a trend across all phenotypes, all examined family structures, and all inheritance patterns. The trend was as follows. The diagnostic yield was improved by an increase in the number of HPO terms. Moreover, with a lower number of HPO terms or less clinical information, there was a higher reporting of variants of unknown significance. These results are echoed in studies from Sun and colleagues in 2018. In this case, they were looking at the electronic health records and pulling out specific HPO terms from patients. Again, they found that the number and quality of HPO terms extracted impact the yield of diagnostics. That is to say, very specific terms and a large number of them is to the benefit of the patient. When you send your patient's information to us at Centogene, we're also, of course, taking this into consideration. You can be assured that we're aiming to do the highest quality analysis possible. Towards this goal, for all complex cases, we request clinical information. And from the clinical information received, we are using HPO terms to annotate the case and identify best possible candidate genes and diseases. In all such cases, we are always obtaining both a patient score and a gene score in order to ensure that we have come up with the best possible candidates possible. For both of these numbers, the scores range from 0 to 1, where a 1 is the highest possible score, and that's what we're seeking to get, or somewhere in that range. These scores are relatively similar to the earlier presented, but take into consideration a bit more of the fuller picture. So in the last examples, it was looking at specific HPO terms compared to one another, whereas here it's considering the full spectrum of all of these specific HPO terms annotated to a given gene for a gene score and how well a patient matches in that sense. And then for a patient score, it's looking at individual variant level and an individual who previously was already analyzed and had that variant and comparing the patient that's now being analyzed back to that individual and looking for a comparative result. Again, hoping to see a relatively high level of significance. Let's go through this one with a bit of a case example. So let's take into consideration a case that's already known from start to finish, a 3-year-old male who is presenting with jaundice, cholestasis, intrahepatic cholestasis, splenomegaly, hepatomegaly, and so forth. Ultimately, we are led to a specific gene, DC2 gene, and identified a variant in this case. With the identified variant, we then look at the gene score and the patient score. While looking at the gene score here, again, it's compared to all HPO terms that are assigned or annotated to that specific gene. In this case, it was a score of 0.72, which suggests that there was reasonable overlap, reasonably high overlap, and we do see quite a bit of similarity. We see cholestasis, hepatomegaly, elevated hepatic transaminases, and so forth. Of course, there are some symptoms here that are not presented by our patient, and that could very well be because of a slightly different variant that they're actually annotated to than the one we found, which is why the next step is very important, and that is to look at patient score. So again, in patient score, we're comparing the in-house patient who's being analyzed, for whom we've identified this DC2 variant, and are questioning, is this patient similar to a previous patient that existed with the same variant in the DC2 gene based on HPO terms? And in this case, we actually came up with a 1.0 score, so it's perfect. We ended up with the expected situation and made the diagnosis. Wonderful. We've now highlighted the role of HPO terms and learned not only that it's important to identify specific terms as low down on the hierarchy as possible, but also to identify as many terms as possible that are relevant to the patient. At this point, what we're going to do is identify a technology that might be of assistance in order to help you place orders with Centogene and more readily convert your patient's clinical information into structured HPOs that you decide in advance of them arriving to our offices. And the reason that that's important is if you have control over sending your clinical information in the HPO terms that you feel are most appropriate, it avoids the need for an interface in between in which our team is responsible for taking the documents that you've submitted and selecting the most appropriate terms. That is to say, if we look at a typical handwritten form, there's a broad array of information. And in not all cases are we receiving a very clear cut, this patient is arriving in-house for this reason. What then needs to happen is someone needs to not only decipher handwriting, but also the intent behind certain things. So in the example placed to the right, we see seizure disorder being written. And again, where seizures are written broadly and without a specific seizure type in that same sentence, the extraction then becomes seizure, a very high superclass. In contrast, if this information is being presented by you yourself through CentoPortal, the option is then you're completely aware that seizures is not a term you feel appropriate and instead would prefer to jump to a specific type of seizure. So CentoPortal is going to be a tool that will allow you to better capture all the clinical information in HPO terms in the way that you want to present them. This will make it easier for deep phenotyping to occur, as again, you've selected more specific terms than may otherwise be suggested by an HPO team if they're reading numerous sheets of handwritten script and aren't certain as to the primary reasons for sending a sample. Moreover, using CentoPortal is actually quite a bit faster than paper, so it will allow you to come up with potentially different ideas and offer some suggestions into the system as to what HPOs you might find are appropriate for your patient. In this way, there's no risk of missing any symptoms. That is to say, you can enter HPO terms, as you'll see in a demo in a moment here, but you can also enter additional written paperwork should you wish to have this as backup. There's also the opportunity to present Excel files to suggest which genes you'd like to add, as well as to upload pedigrees or other similar information. So it really does become quite a comprehensive opportunity. Moreover, in using CentoPortal, it allows a direct transfer of the information as you present it to our medical evaluation team. Where there's an extraction of any clinical data from notes, it requires, of course, as it would in clinic as well, someone to go through those and present them to the next team. Using CentoPortal, it is an opportunity for the verbatim text to then be passed to the next team in the manner that you wish it to be represented. So at this point, we're just going to take an opportunity to go live over to CentoPortal. And I've already set up a case. In this particular analysis, we've set it up as a whole exome gold solo. And I've previously entered in our patient details for anyone who isn't familiar with this. Those are the two steps that you originally need to do before moving on to clinical details. Next up is the clinical details section, and here it becomes extremely simple. As you see, as soon as I click onto the field, it offers me the opportunity to enter text. I can enter adenomas and come up with similar suggestions. Neoplasm is higher. I wouldn't necessarily choose to go with that. All entered terms end up in selected symptoms so that there's an opportunity to readily view those and change if needed, bleeding, for instance. Should a patient be unaffected, there's also the opportunity on the right-hand side to click unaffected, at which point you will not be able to enter any symptoms. It's important to note here is I can enter specific terms. So in this case, I'm concerned about an atrial septal defect in one of my patients. And in addition to having entered that one term, I can upload specific lists of genes using Excel by dragging and dropping. And I can also add any specific pedigrees, should I have one. Which is to say that all of the information that you would typically find on paper can be placed in here in a matter of minutes and ends up with a very clear overview for the user as to what you've submitted and exactly what we will receive and then pass on to the next teams. Please note, if you are using CentoPortal, it is also going to be an opportunity for you to not simply submit materials that you'd like to have, but readily be able to view all orders in the future. For anyone who's previously submitted an order to us, you know that this is our primary portal for sharing results, and these are now available to you for the remainder of time, which is extremely convenient. Moreover, patients that have been entered once in CentoPortal, so for instance, a patient for whom you've requested a Cento exome at one point in time, their data will remain available for you so that should you want to place a follow-up study such as the whole genome, it's simply a click away and you're able to send that in. Please do note, if you submit an order online, to send the sample material to us in a way that includes the QR code, so that scannable code that's on the first page once you've done it, or in some other way that includes the OR code, which is automatically generated after you finish an order. These two numbers will help us to then link the samples back up when they arrive in-house with the information submitted online. Wonderful. So we've now managed to make it through to the end in quite decent time. In order to summarize this, it's important to note that we've gone from start to finish with a history of why the terms were needed in the first place. That is, that ontologies offer the opportunity to link symptoms and diseases, both for the bridging the gap between clinicians and geneticists, as well as to allow for better deep phenotyping. We've highlighted in addition that you should be aware of the very specific terms of HPO and the benefit of the hierarchical structure, that parents are associated with their children, meaning that the more specific a term can be, the more likely we are to identify associated genes and associated diseases. We've covered the idea that beyond that, the more specific terms can be and broader, the better we are. And we've identified through CentoPortal an easy-to-use tool that allows you to directly enter HPO terms and know that the HPOs that you have entered are transferring through to the geneticist without a middleman. An additional benefit in the CentoPortal option is that you have no limitation to the HPO terms that you're entering. Should you have any concerns that you are not specific enough, you can continue to go as specific as you'd like, or if there's concerns that you're being too general, you can play around on that. We will have a second processing opportunity in-house and relook at it. But again, the benefit is where you have a large list, you can keep entering as much information as you'd like. And again, as we've commented, the more terms possible, the more likely it is that we end up with an appropriate diagnosis for your patients. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and open the floor for questions or comments. So one of the first questions that I'm reading here, and I'll read it out loud to you, is if a child's head circumference is normal relative to body proportions, would we call it microcephaly versus for a larger head? So if a child's head is normal compared to body proportions, there are, of course, opportunities medically to not place that into a microcephaly category. This is, however, for the choice of the clinician, whether or not you would consider it to be microcephaly when submitting your documentation. If head circumference is provided without additional information to allow anyone to understand that it's proportional to the remainder of the body, then, for instance, only a measurement is given and the age of the patient and the sex of the patient, then that information will be understood to be microcephaly. So the next question is a very great question. So if someone uses an improper HPO term rather than the usual term, is there a chance of missing or wrong diagnosis? So if I'm understanding this correctly, it would be saying, if somebody's using a different synonym of an HPO term, is there a chance of missing the diagnosis? The answer to that would be no. The HPO terms capture a very large array of synonyms, and in some cases 20 or so for the same term, which means by using any variety of those synonyms, you would still be identifying the same gene candidate and similar. Now, to the contrary, if a wrong HPO term is provided, so that is to say, a case where perhaps a clinician is having an interview with a family and is writing multiple clinical information from multiple family members on the same sheet of paper and makes a slip and writes schizophrenia under the brother as opposed to under the great uncle. Yes, there is of course a chance that we are going to have a search that takes us in the wrong direction, away from the primary concern, but not that it's going to lead to a wrong diagnosis, just that it might actually alert to something completely different and not focus on the actual issue at hand. So of course, appropriate HPO terms are essential. Synonyms are wonderful and fine, but appropriate to the patient that's at hand. And when in doubt, when one's not sure if it should be more specific and is wavering between a parent class and a child, then it's better to go with the more general term, as it will capture it just fine. But you can know that in choosing the child, it will also then consider the parent term. But there is still that chance of putting a bit more directed emphasis there than was needed. Third question that I have then is, I currently place orders with the standard form, and I'm using tick boxes of the table terms and writing brief summaries for each case. Are those tick boxes HPO terms, or should I be adding additional information? Very good question. On our paper order forms, we do offer a table of symptoms as a starting point for clinicians to indicate clinical observations and findings. The options in this table can very well be matched back to HPO terms, and this information is going to be extracted in-house. That said, these tables are a starting point and often do include higher level superclasses, as the forms need to be appropriate for a wide variety of conditions. A good example would be something like the term abnormality of skeletal system. Yes, you do find this in the form, and yes, of course, one can tick this box. That said, it's a superclass, and it's going to be matched to that superclass term. For that reason, it would be an advantage for the diagnostic process for additional information to be included where possible to provide more information about the specific abnormalities of skeletal system seen. If the table is not sufficient for you, then the suggestion would be to add additional text in the clinical information portion, to go online and suggest HPO terms specifically and write them should you want, or to move to the CentoPortal platform where that same superclass term is going to help suggest some subclasses that may be appropriate. Fourth question that we have is regarding languages. What languages can I enter terminology into in CentoPortal? At this time, our HPO term option is limited to English. However, we're taking actions to make it available in Spanish in the future. And as the language catalogs improve for HPO terminology into other languages, we will also make the efforts to make sure that it's available in multiple mother languages. If there's no additional questions, then I'd like to thank you for your time and for taking part in today's webinar. At this point, in order to gain some more information regarding your experience, we are going to launch a poll. So please take a few minutes to finish it out. I hope you gained some useful information and look forward to seeing you at another Cento webinar. Thank you.